On a hot August day in the year 1893, a husband and wife were found murdered in their home in a town on the eastern seaboard of the United States. The murders would be eventually pinned on the couple's daughter, who, with their maid, were the only ones home at the time. Even in broad daylight, on their busy, bustling street in the town of Fall River, no commotion was heard, and no perpetrator was ever found. To this day, the mystery of the murders of Andrew and Abby Borden remain unsolved. All the while, history continues to point the finger at one person, their daughter. With this, the head-splitting story of Lizzie Borden is coming up in this week's episode. Stay with us. Hello again, everyone. I'm Nick, and you're tuning in for a new chapter of the Insidious Agenda podcast. On this week's episode, we're going to discuss the axe murders of the Borden family, their daughter Lizzie, and their now haunted home. Ensure you're subscribed to this podcast so you don't miss out on any of the weekly episodes. Now it's time to turn down your lights, close your eyes, let things go quiet, and just listen for a moment. Maybe you're alone. Maybe you're not. Now, follow along to the sound of my voice, and let's get into our story. On the 19th of July, in the year 1860, was born the daughter of Sarah Anthony and Andrew Jackson Borden, whom they named Lisbeth, or Lizzie. She was born in the town of Fall River, Massachusetts, a town about 50 miles south from the busy port of Boston. Andrew Borden had grown up in a family of English and Welsh heritage. In his youth, he grew up in a very modest home, with a family that struggled financially, even though he was a descendant of those who were wealthy and influential. He would eventually find success and a great amount of money in the sales of furniture and caskets. He was even able to turn a coin and become a successful property developer. In addition to this, he held other positions, such as the directorships of numerous textile mills and the Durfee Safe Deposit and Trust Company. He was also the president of the Union Savings Bank. Because of his hard work and follow-on success, he became the owner and investor of various commercial properties in Fall River. For all of his accumulated wealth, Andrew was always known for looking a bit miserable in his appearance, as well as being extremely frugal, almost to the point that he would appear cheap. For example, in their town, it was common for wealthy people at this time in history to have indoor plumbing, which the Borden house did not. Also, many of the wealthiest residents of Fall River lived in a community known as The Hill, as it was further outside the industrial sector, while the Bordens did not. Lizzie, along with her sister Emma, had a religious upbringing and were avid churchgoers, attending the Central Congregational Church on Rock Street. Lizzie was very involved with her church, often teaching Sunday school to children of those who had recently immigrated to the United States. She was also heavily involved with an organization known as the Young People's Society of Christian Endeavor, which was formed as an interdenominational body that encouraged young people to work together in getting to know the Lord. In this organization, she served on the executive, holding the positions of secretary and treasurer. She was also a participating member in the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Ladies' Fruit and Flower Mission. Early on in Lizzie's life, when she was only about 3 years old, her mother Sarah would pass away due to uterine congestion and spinal disease. At this time in history, uterine congestion was a bit of a catch-all term for most gynecological problems, and in some severe cases, may have even been caused by ovarian cancer. About 3 years after Sarah's death, Andrew Borden would remarry to a woman named Abby Gray. Living with Abby, things would become infinitely easier for the Borden family. Andrew made enough of a living from his career and investments to support Abby, his 2 daughters, and even made enough money to employ 2 servants in the home. As Lizzie and Emma were both unmarried women into their 30s and 40s, it was social custom at the time for the girls to remain living with their father. The relationship between the girls and Abby was not warm or welcoming. It would be later told by Lizzie that the girls referred to Abby as Mrs. Borden and believed that she had only courted and married their father for his money. The marriage would cause a bit of a schism in the family dynamic. One of the maids, named Bridget Sullivan, or as she went by Maggie, who was a 25-year-old Irish immigrant, would state that the girls would rarely eat meals with their father and stepmother. On one occasion, in May of 1892, Andrew killed a good number of pigeons that had come to live in the barn with a hatchet. Just before he did this, Lizzie had built a roost in the barn for those pigeons. She became visibly and very upset over her father's decision to kill them, but the extent of her displeasure has never been clear. Tensions had really begun to grow in the family in early 1892. Andrew would make gifts of real estate in the form of houses to a number of members of Abby's family. The final straw for Lizzie and Emma was when a house was gifted to Abby's sister. The 2 girls decided that they would no longer remain quiet, and they demanded that they be given the property the family had lived in until their mother died, which was a current rental property for Andrew. He would sell them that property for the sum of only $1, which they would later sell back to him for $5,000. A family argument in July of 1892 would lead Lizzie and Emma to leave Fall River for an extended period of time and coming to stay in New Bedford. They would return to Fall River sometime in late July of that year, but Lizzie would stay in a rooming house until early August before she returned home. In the first days of August, the Borden family became violently ill. It was speculated that it may have been from meat that had spoiled from being out too long. That being said, Abby still believed that the meat was actually poisoned, owing to her husband not being popular within the community. On the 3rd of August, the Bordens were visited unexpectedly by a man named John Morse, who was the brother of Andrew Borden's deceased wife, Sarah. It was believed that John had come to visit with Andrew to discuss a transfer of property. John had arrived later in the evening and was quartered in the family's guest room for the night. He had no luggage with him, but he did say that he planned to stay for a while. The next morning, the family sat down to breakfast, of which Andrew, Abby, Lizzie, John, and Maggie Sullivan attended. After breakfast was finished, Andrew and John retired to a sitting room where they conversed for about an hour. At around 8:48, John would depart the home to buy a pair of oxen and visit his niece in town. He planned to return home around noon and join the Bordens for lunch. Andrew would also depart the home around 9 going out for his daily walk. Abby would ask Maggie to clean the windows on the ground floor of the home, following which Maggie would return to her quarters on the 3rd floor to rest. Abby would head upstairs sometime between 9 and 10:30 to straighten up the guest quarters, a job normally performed by Lizzie and Emma. Sometime during that period, Abby Borden was brutally murdered in that room. She was struck first on the side of the head with a hatchet, cutting her just above her left ear. This caused her to spin around and fall face down on the floor, creating injuries to her nose and forehead. Her assailant then struck her with the hatchet another 17 times in the back of the head. This would be the last of Abby Borden. Andrew returned from his morning stroll around 10:30. When he tried to open the door with his key, he found he was unable to open it. He knocked to alert someone he was there, and Maggie came down to let him in. She discovered that something jammed the door. Maggie later said that she then heard laughter coming from the top of the stairs that she believed was Lizzie, although she couldn't see her. Lizzie would later deny ever having been upstairs during that time. Now, had anyone gone to the 2nd floor at this time, Abby's body would have been clearly visible to anyone. When Andrew asked his daughter where Abby was, Lizzie informed him that she received summons to visit a sick friend of hers. Lizzie then helped her father remove his boots and get his slippers on. He decided he would lay down on the couch for a while and take a nap. Lizzie then let Maggie know about a local department store sale in town and granted her permission to go if she so chose. Maggie, still feeling unwell at this time, declined and decided to return to her bedroom instead and lay down for a nap. Around 11:10, Maggie would awake to the sound of Lizzie calling to her. "Maggie, come quick, Father's dead. Somebody came in and killed him." What Maggie saw when she arrived was the body of Andrew Borden slumped on the couch in the sitting room, having been struck 10 or 11 times with a hatchet. One of his eyes was even split in two, which led to the belief that he was attacked while he was sleeping. It had happened very recently, owing to Andrew's wounds, which were still bleeding. Lizzie would send Maggie to fetch Dr. Borden, an American doctor who lived across the street from them. When it was discovered he was not home, Maggie was then sent to fetch a neighbor from down the street by the name of Mrs. Churchill. When they arrived back to the Borden house, Lizzie asked them to check upstairs as she thought she had heard Abby come home. As soon as their eyes were level with the 2nd floor, they discovered the body of Abby lying face down. Dr. Borden would return home and rush over to the Borden house, where he pronounced Abby and Andrew dead at the scene. One truly fascinating piece of information here is that when it was discovered Dr. Borden was not at home, Lizzie's first instinct was to fetch a neighbor. Not the Irish immigrant doctor who lived on the other side of them, or the French-Canadian doctor who lived behind them, but would only await the arrival of the American Dr. Borden. The police were called, who immediately suspected Lizzie when they arrived. Lizzie was questioned, but not taken into custody. It was noted that the police officers disliked her attitude, and something felt a bit off about her. Her answers to her questions were very odd and contradictory. They described her as being extremely calm and poised. Through the course of their investigation, none of the police officers ever checked Lizzie's physical body for any evidence, least of all any bloodstains or splatter. They searched her room, but found nothing of interest, noting that they didn't do a proper search due to Lizzie not feeling well. It's also very important to note that during all of these events, Emma Borden was out of town visiting her friends. Lizzie's account of the events was such that she was in the barn trying to escape the suffocating heat of August weather when she heard a groan and some sort of scraping noise. She returned to the parlor around 11 a.m. When she saw the body of her father, she yelled for the maid who would call the police. She would recant this statement only 2 hours later and actually state she had heard nothing preceding to her returning to the home. When searching through the remainder of the house, the police found no signs of forced entry. They did find 2 axes and 2 hatchets in the basement of the home. They noticed that one of the axes was broken, but found something a bit more peculiar than that. All of the tools in the basement were covered in dust, looking like they hadn't been used in quite some time. The broken axe appeared as though it was covered in dust or ash and made to appear as though it too was unused. The broken axe appeared as though it was covered in dust or ash, only to appear as though it too were unused. This, however, was brushed off as a mere coincidence, and none of those tools were taken into evidence. Following the investigation, the police would remove the bodies of Andrew and Abby and left the house. When the corpses of Andrew and Abby Borden went through an autopsy, their stomachs were examined closely because of the earlier illness that had swept through the family. Here, Abby's theory about them being poisoned was disproven, as no traces of any sort of poisonous substance were found in their bodies. Reports had also begun to come forward about a strange individual that was seen leaving the Borden home on the 4th of August in a hurry. They were described as carrying something long, wrapped in newspaper. Unfortunately, there was no further evidence or witness testimony of this, and that individual has never been located. The night following the murders, a friend of Lizzie and Emma's named Alice Russell stayed at Lizzie's house. John Morse was still at the home as well, now quartered in the attic guest room. The police had created a cordon around the property and remained around the home on the night of the 4th. One police officer attested to having witnessed Lizzie and Alice going down to the cellar carrying with them a kerosene lantern and a bucket. He then saw both women exit the cellar, followed by Lizzie going back down on her own. He was unable to see exactly what she was doing down there, but appeared as though she was hunched over a sink. Another police officer had discovered that the day before the murders, Lizzie was believed to have purchased hydrocyanic acid at a local drugstore, which she claimed was for the maintenance of her furred clothing. The following day, on the 5th of August, John Morse had attempted to leave the Borden house but was mobbed by hundreds of people who had taken an interest in the murders, and he had to be escorted by the police back into the home. On the 6th, the police would again return to the interior of the home for a more thorough search of the residence. They inspected the girls' clothing and finally then confiscated the broken hatchet head from the basement. That evening, a policeman would visit Lizzie and inform her that she was suspect in the murders of her father and stepmother. On the morning of the 7th, Alice awoke to find Lizzie in the kitchen attempting to tear up and burn a dress of hers. Lizzie had offered the explanation that it was covered in paint and needed to be destroyed. It has never been determined if this was the dress she was wearing on the day of the murders. On the 8th of August, Lizzie was called to appear before an inquest into the murders. She requested to have her family's attorney present, but was refused. This was due to a state statute that stated inquests must be held in private. She was in a very different state of mind than she was the date of the murders, and Lizzie had to be administered morphine in order to calm her down. Her behavior became very erratic, and she would refuse to answer a number of questions, even if they could have been of benefit to her. This may have been a complicating factor from the morphine dosages that she was administered. Like it was on the day she was questioned, a lot of Lizzie's responses contradicted one another. She would explain that she was in the kitchen reading during the morning of the events. Another time, she was in the dining room ironing, etc. She also said that she had removed her father's boots when the crime scene photos clearly show him wearing boots. The district attorney was described as being very aggressive and confrontational with Lizzie. And following the inquest, on the 11th of August, Lizzie Borden was finally arrested by warrant and jailed. The testimony she gave during the inquest was later thrown out and ruled as inadmissible. Even though that testimony was thrown out, it caused a shift in the beliefs of her friends who, up to that point, had maintained she was innocent. A grand jury would begin hearing the evidence on the 7th of November and officially indicted Lizzie on the 2nd of December. It wouldn't be until the 5th of June, 1893, that her trial would officially begin in New Bedford. Prosecuting the case were Hosea Knowlton and William Moody, the latter of whom would go on to become a Supreme Court justice. Arguing for Lizzie's defense were Andrew Jennings, Melvin Adams, and George Robinson. 5 days before the trial even began, on the 1st of June, another axe murder was committed in Fall River. The victim of this attack was a woman named Bertha Manchester, who was found hacked to death in her kitchen. The similarities between that murder and the Bordens murder were striking. Fast forward 1 year, and a Portuguese immigrant named José Correia de Melo was convicted of that murder. But he had an alibi for not being in Fall River at the time of the Bordens murder. Throughout the trial, there were many major points of discussion and presentation. The first was the broken hatchet found in the Bordens' basement. Unfortunately, this evidence did not hold up, as the prosecution was unable to convincingly demonstrate that it was, in fact, the murder weapon. Alice Russell, Lizzie's friend, was called upon to attest to what she witnessed. She said that she saw Lizzie attempting to shred and burn one of her dresses on the kitchen stove. She would also confirm that the dress had become soiled when it brushed against wet paint. Lizzie's whereabouts during the murder of Andrew were also brought into question. Lizzie had testified that she left the home to go out to the family barn and was out of the house for about 20 to 30 minutes. Witnesses named Hyman Lubinsky and Charles Gardner would confirm that they witnessed Lizzie leaving the barn around about 11:03. Cadavers of Andrew and Abby Borden were also presented during the trial. Their heads were removed during the autopsy and presented as evidence. When she saw the skulls brought forward, Lizzie collapsed. The report that Lizzie had also attempted to purchase acid was not admitted as evidence due to there being no further proof, and the judge ruled that, as it was too remote in time, that it had no connection to the murders. After all the evidence and witness testimony was presented, the jury began their deliberation on the 20th of June, 1893. They took only 1.5 hours before returning to the courtroom. Lizzie Borden was acquitted of the murders of Andrew and Abby. When she left the courtroom, she would go on to tell reporters that she was the happiest woman in the world. Many different theories had begun to emerge about the evidence and circumstances of the case. Some believed that Lizzie might have committed the murders while in some form of psychological state. Another was that she was sexually and physically abused by her father. But there was little evidence to support this, due to the methods of collecting evidence would have been drastically different in 1892 compared to modern day. One of the theories that actually garnered a decent amount of support was that Lizzie and Maggie were discovered to be in a relationship. It was believed that Abby may have caught them together and reacted in an unsupportive way, causing the couple to murder her. When Andrew returned home, it was also possible that there was a confession to the relationship, and he may have acted the same way Abby did, also being murdered in a blind rage because of it. It wouldn't be until years later in her life that Lizzie was rumored to have been gay. There was no belief that Maggie was, however, as she married a man while working as a maid later in Montana. It wasn't until she was on her deathbed in 1948 that Maggie Sullivan gave a confession to her sister that she had changed her testimony on the witness stand in order to protect Lizzie. One of the other key suspects was John Morse. He was quite estranged of the family, rarely having called after the death of Sarah. However, by pure coincidence, the day following his unexpected arrival, the Bordens were murdered. He too had an alibi for the time of the murders that was described as absurdly perfect and over-detailed. Normally, when someone tells a lie, it's best to leave out intricate detail so it's more believable. Of course, Emma was considered a suspect as well, even though she was in Fairhaven, about 24 kilometers away. Following the trial, Lizzie and Emma moved into the neighborhood in Fall River known as The Hill. Their new home was named Maplecroft by Lizzie and employed a staff of 5. Because Abby was killed before Andrew, her estate passed to Andrew first, and then, on his death, was passed to Lizzie and Emma. They did spend a considerable amount of money to settle claims from Abby's family. Unfortunately for Lizzie, because of all the attention the case had garnered, her reputation was destroyed. She was treated extremely harshly and ostracized by the community of Fall River. In 1897, she was accused of shoplifting in Rhode Island, and this only drug her back into the public eye. Unfortunately, in 1905, Lizzie threw a party for an actress named Nance O'Neill, causing a bad argument with her sister. It ended so badly that Emma moved out and the two never saw one another again. On the 1st of June, 1927, Lizzie would pass away from pneumonia after a surgery to remove her gallbladder. There were no to little details published about her funeral, and it was believed very few people attended. Only 9 days after Lizzie passed, Emma would follow, dying from chronic nephritis in New Hampshire. The sisters were never married and are now buried next to one another at Oak Grove Cemetery in Fall River, Massachusetts. So, with the story of the Borden family being largely based in true crime, how exactly does this tie into the paranormal? Well, it's quite possible that the spirits of the Borden family never left the home. Since 1996, the Borden home at 230 2nd Street has been a bed and breakfast under its owner, Martha McGinn. According to Martha, the most requested room is the guest room in which Abby Borden was murdered. There have been many documented paranormal investigations that have taken place in the Bordens' home. Many of the phenomena that have been captured on audio and video include mysterious knocks, videos of orbs, and probably the most fascinating are the spectral voices that can be heard through the spirit boxes and audio recordings, known in the paranormal community as EVP or electronic voice phenomena. In order to gain a better understanding, before we dive into some of these findings, let's talk a bit about EVP. Probably one of the most useful tools in the field of ghost hunting and parapsychology is EVP. These are sounds that have been recorded through audio and interpreted as the voices of spirits coming across into our plane of existence. Many explanations have been made for the function of EVP and what it truly is. There exists the belief that human beings are able to leave thoughts or feelings on an electronic medium through a concept known as psychokinesis, or more simply, the ability to influence physical items without physically interacting with them. Now, I'm going to cover EVP in more depth in a later episode about ghost hunting, its origins, instruments, and modern popularity, a future episode. Of the spirits to have been reported by investigators at the Borden house include, of course, Abby and Andrew, who met their demise in that home by a killer that was never caught. Other spirits that have been encountered in the home include the 2 children who were murdered by their mother at the home just next to the Bordens in 1848, and possibly the ghost of Lizzie herself, although researchers have never concretely communicated with the confirmed spirit of Lizzie. In a darker turn, there has been something encountered in the basement, something that hides in the dark, watching those who visit and work in the home. A housekeeper, when in the basement exchanging linens, encountered something crouching behind a set of boxes. It was a dark figure, described with long, black hair. There is also what appears to be a face in one of the walls in the basement. Could this be the face and the dark entity tied together? In a lighter tale from the Borden home, there exists the story that if you leave money on the dresser in your room, that Andrew Borden will let you have a peaceful evening. There have also been many reports of footsteps following those taking tours or staying the night, the laughter of children, and many other things. Other fascinating things that await eager investigators at the Borden home are that guests may choose to stay in the room Abby was murdered in. That's a hotbed for paranormal activity. Even the dining room table where guests eat their meals is the actual table in which the autopsies of Andrew and Abby Borden were performed. One of the most interesting things that I came across when researching the episode was from a paranormal investigation performed by an investigator named Amanda Mullet. Amanda was able to make contact with the presumed spirit of Andrew Borden, who identified himself by name. She asked Andrew Borden if it was John Morse, to which he replied, yes. There is no way to confirm if this was truly the spirit of Andrew Borden, but it's a neat story nonetheless. I'll post the link to Amanda's investigation in our show notes and our socials, and I highly recommend you check it out. The Lizzie Borden house was sold in 2021 to Lance Zahl, who operates U.S. Ghost Adventures in over 35 states across the U.S. He plans to keep the business of the bed and breakfast running and plans to expand its reach to the public by adding different events. Whether you believe that Lizzie Borden deserved to have been acquitted or not is something that will be debated for the entirety of history. There was certainly a lack of concrete evidence in her trial, and the remainder of the evidence presented was purely circumstantial. The one truly terrifying thing about the case is that to this day, the perpetrator has never been caught or brought to justice. Unfortunately, where too many years have passed, the individual responsible is long gone. Could it really have been Lizzie herself? With much tension between her stepmother and father and the dealing of the property to Abby's family, it's certainly plausible that a motive existing for Lizzie was there. Could it have been from a fit of rage caused by being discovered with a lover in the housemaid that was unaccepted by the family? Could it really have been John Morse, the brother of Andrew's former wife, who had come back to put an end to Andrew Borden? Many questions remain unexplained and many theories can be formulated. The case of the murders of Andrew and Abby Borden and their daughter Lizzie have been retold in many movies and songs throughout history. The most well-known of which is a nursery rhyme that will be remembered and sang for as long as the story is known. In closing, this song, wrongfully accused or not, will condemn Lizzie for all eternity. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. If you're hearing this message, that means you made it to the end of this week's story covering Lizzie Borden and her haunted home. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, and I'd like to thank you very much for listening. For more information about the podcast, please visit our link tree in the show notes. Before you go, remember to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of our weekly episodes. If you like this episode, please share it with a friend. And if you'd like to show your support for the podcast, donations can be made to our PayPal account in the link tree. And remember to come back next week for another of the Warrens case files and the famous haunting known as the Amityville Horror. New episodes are released every Tuesday at 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious agenda. I'll see you again next week.